Good afternoon, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. This is one of those official classes that you can get, credit, CPE credit for the different certifications. My understanding is that you have to be in the room for an hour, and at the end of the session, you're able to swipe your badge at the back of at that table back there to be able to then get the CPE credits if you want them. So I'm not making the rules, but that's the way they laid it out for me. Again, my name is Stan Wisman. I run our Chief Technologist team here in North America. It's great to be with you. This is the first time I've been to this event, and I'm really impressed by the level of participation and the different topics. The thing that I want to do today is help you better understand software supply chain issues. And if you have questions, certainly ask them, but I'll try to leave some time at the end as well. A little bit about my background. I got started at the National Security Agency back in the early 80s. My initial part of my career was around an approach of evaluating operating systems, databases, and other things. We had the Orange Book evaluation process. We had common criteria. I had the opportunity to be a common criteria lab director at Arca Systems. But honestly, that process is so long to get things through it. And I sort of lost the enthusiasm about that approach. And I switched over to software security in the early 2000s. I had the opportunity to lead the Cigital software security consulting team, and then carried on at Booz Allen, doing it there, software assurance at Booz Allen. And then one of the activities I had while I was at Booz Allen was to participate in DHS's Build Security In project. It was led by Joe Jarzenbeck, and there was a working group around acquisition of software. And how can you improve that process to ensure that you're actually acquiring more secure software and not inherently adding risk to your organization by acquiring software that has vulnerabilities and flaws in it. Coming up with the kind of questions you should ask, as well as the RFP and contract language. And I was co-chairing this with Mary Perlitis from the National Defense University. And I thought we did some good groundwork, but the bottom line here is that I've been involved with this kind of concept of how you secure the supply chain for quite some time. This is the agenda today, where I'm going to discuss the importance and challenges of how you secure software supply chains, and ultimately ways in which we can hopefully address these challenges. I'll go through some of the basics as far as the concept, and then some of the related industry and government activities going on, as well as wrapping up with a case study of how we're doing things at Microfocus. We're a software company, so we're wrestling with this ourselves. Now, a supply chain that we all partake in is the water we drink, right? Whether you drink water from the tap, or like my mom, will only drink water from the bottle, which drives me nuts sometimes. Do you really have an awareness of where that water came from or what's in it? Perhaps not. Do we really understand what's in our water? Same thing, do we really understand what's in our software? Do we understand the lineage and pedigree and the inherent risk of the software we're introducing into our enterprises? And as for the ingredients, we're focused many times on the functional aspects of the water as well as our software, right? If you look at the nutritional facts of a bottle of water, many times you're looking at, are there truly 0 calories, or, I consume now recovery water after I work out. How many grams of protein are in that? You may look at the functional aspects, and we do the same thing with our software. But do we really pay attention to the other fine print and the other ingredients? I mean, if you look at the right, and it's difficult to read here, but I've highlighted the fact that it has magnesium sulfate, which is basically Epsom salt. in the water. And if you drink too much of that, you're basically poisoning yourself. So are we also consuming software with critical vulnerabilities that will expose our enterprises to unacceptable risk, right? So trying to help with this analogy, understand that, we have a lot of components in our software, right? These components are server-side logic, client-side logic, libraries, data storage, data transport, APIs, and many more. And with all these components to secure and building a secure application, it can seem really daunting at times. An example of this is Java. Just picking a particular application or a programming language in this case, but half the enterprise applications out there today are written in Java, making it basically ubiquitous in our enterprises. And by all measures, Java has been successful. Unfortunately, this also means that Java applications are some of the most frequently targeted and attacked applications by hackers. And just look at how many vulnerabilities have been discovered in Java over time. And they're leveraging those vulnerabilities. So that's something to realize, that even something that's as popular and inherently everywhere in our enterprises like Java has these problems. And software supply chains are becoming more complex as DevOps teams look to build products in-house using third-party open source code. And while this accelerates time to value, it also could open up the organization to additional risk. If you guys recall back 2 years ago on the 8th of December in 2020, FireEye announced that they were a victim to a nation-state attack, and several days later they discovered evidence that attackers had a backdoor in SolarWinds software that was dubbed ultimately as Sunburst. Almost a year to the day later, a zero-day vulnerability crashed onto the scene on 9 September called Log4Shell. The vulnerabilities in this library exposed some of the world's most popular applications and services to attack. And Spring4Shell, came out not too much longer, and that may not be as widespread. The bottom line is we're going to have these things pop up time and time again, and we have to be able to understand, what we have in our environment to be able to react appropriately to minimize that exposure. And how bad is this problem? Well, software supply chain attacks have taken off in the past 5 years, and one of the companies that's tracking this is a company called Sonatype. For the 4 years leading up to June 2019, Sonatype documented 216 software supply chain attacks. And the following year, the number of attacks topped 900. And in 2021, and last year, the number of attacks on open source suppliers jumped 650% to more than 12,000. So that gives you the sort of like the idea of how the attackers are looking at this as an attack vector of choice now. Now, overall, attacks on the software supply chain can fall into two broad categories, comprising of either the development pipeline, software development pipeline, or vulnerabilities in the subcomponents and their dependencies. Typically, we think of threats as being either outside or external threat actors, or inside and insider threats. But another way of looking at this is really the dependencies is on an alternative view of intentional or unintentional threats. So external threats target the intentional injection of malicious code into software dependencies. So again, of the two branches, I'm taking the intentional side of that code branch, as it were. And if you look at how they can do this, one of the useful tools out there is provided by Google. Google came out with supply chain levels of software artifacts. It's known as SLSA or SALSA. And SALSA is a framework for ensuring the integrity of software artifacts to prevent attacks. And what's shown here is potential ways in which you can attack that development pipeline. And the different ways you see under source and build threats and dependency threats that you could do that. I know it's perhaps hard to read on that screen there. But these are different kind of attack vectors targeting developers and suppliers of software, targeting either the source code, again, the build process, the update mechanisms, and, attackers could inject malicious code at the creation of a package. They could do it in the source or commit process. They could compromise the build system itself. They could actually mess around with the code repo. So there are a number of different ways that these external attackers can impact that dev pipeline. This is another way of sort of representing that and it's a bit of an eye chart, but the attacker's goal is sort of at the top, and the goal is to inject malicious code. And so how can they do that? They can impact, again, the package creation. They can do something like type squatting as an example, or they could go down the other path and inject malicious code into the code repo by setting up an alternative repo. So there are numerous different vectors they can take. And we are seeing this in the wild. Diving into the Node Package Manager or NPM example on the far right that happened in 2021, a security researcher used typos in the names of common software components and packages to demonstrate that mistyped library names in software can lead to compromises. The researcher succeeded in spreading his code to more than 35 different companies, including Microsoft and Apple, using 3 different languages and what he termed as a dependency confusion attack, and others have referred to it as a namespace confusion attack. And by the next month, more than 10,000 copycats were found on the Node Package Manager ecosystem, according to Sonatype. Again, Sonatype is doing a great job of tracking some of this. So that's just one example of what's happening out there. And again, on the one hand, it's great when these researchers prove that something can be done. This happened also with Log4Shell, where a researcher, exercised the vulnerability, and then within a month, it was being exercised everywhere once it had been proven. So these copycats are taking advantage of that, and we don't know when that's going to exactly happen. It's sort of like we have to be cognizant of what's going on in the community to be able to react fast. So any questions about that whole concept of the sort of like the external threat that is intentionally injecting malware into the process? All right. Well, I'm going to switch gears to the other side, which is around the insider or unintentional threats. The reuse of code has major benefits, right, as far as our development processes. I think the software industry has embraced the fact that we're going to reuse code. It saves time and effort. However, developers who use components without auditing them or understanding the potential risks they're adding to their organization by using those components become, in a sense, unintentional insiders. And that is not necessarily saying there's anything malicious in what they're doing. They're just doing it to be more productive on the development side and inherently adding risk to the organization. In general, 70% of code today relies on open source software. I've seen different figures actually on this. Sometimes it's as high as, actually I say 70% and I have 80% on the slide. So I've seen 70 and 80% as far as the amount of open source software and applications. I don't know what everybody else has heard. But the trend is going to go up. I think even if you think about what's going on in the government space, the new, well, not so new, but the White House Technology Director, David Recordon, I think that's how you pronounce his name, but he's a major open source advocate. And he previously was leading the Facebook open source projects, and he's now at the White House and promoting that agencies use a broader adoption of open source, and microservices as well within the federal government. So I think open source use is going to continue to increase, especially in the context of government software. 69% of the time, again, this is a finding from Sonatype, that 65% of the time, developers make a poor choice when updating third-party dependencies, and 29% of the popular projects contain known vulnerabilities. So you can't really depend many times on the developers making the right decision as far as which components go in. So, the reality is we're going to continue to use open source, and that's going to increase. Developers are doing what they need to do to get the functional requirements met, and they're making decisions that inherently look like they're not necessarily making the right decision in a lot of cases. So we sort of have to help them make the right decision. So again, they're unintentionally introducing risks into the software, and there are more than 900 different types of weaknesses that are possible, and people make mistakes. That's how you have CVEs, right? So, again, I've sort of beat this drum already as far as examples out there, but there really isn't at the high level any significant difference between the two, right? I mean, you have certainly threat actors that are trying to do intentional injection, and you have the inadvertent insider threat who's unintentionally doing it, but the result is still that you have software potentially that has weaknesses in it that can be exploited downstream. So whether it's intentional or unintentional, we need to switch from being reactive to being much more proactive in how we do things. And, we can no longer, push this off onto somebody else or assume it's going to be handled by somebody else downstream. We have to ensure that the software and services used by our enterprises are free from known vulnerabilities, and it requires a multi-pronged approach to do this. I think that if you trust the components and libraries that you're using and track the provenance of the code throughout your dev pipelines, you'll have a much better understanding of not only your own processes and have confidence about them, but also can convey that process ultimately to the consumer of the software and application. So again, we just got to be more proactive, otherwise we're going to be blindsided again. It's a funny little picture there, but I just thought it'd be kind of cute. Anyway, any questions about those two before I move on to the next section? So the good news is there's a lot of activity going on, both on the industry side as well as the government side. In January, the White House, under President Biden, convened a government and private sector stakeholders meeting to discuss the initiatives to improve security of open source software and ways to collaborate and drive these kind of improvements. There are a number of industry efforts underway. So how many people are familiar with OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project? So Cyclone DX and CSVS are two big initiatives or projects within the context of OWASP that have made a big impact. You have, I mentioned earlier, Google and Salsa. You have the Cloud Native organization. So they've done a great job of helping the industry understand how to view the threats, like with Salsa, as well as actions they can take. The next few slides, I'm going to focus on what some of the government activities going on in the space are. So in December 2018, the DHS established the Information and Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, or the ICT SCRIM Task Force. And it's charged with identifying challenges and developing actionable solutions to enhance global ICT supply chain resilience. and it's composed of federal government as well as industry representatives from across ICT sectors, and it serves agencies as the center of gravity for supply chain risk management partnership activities. So the folks at CISA are doing a lot of great work. One of the things that when I was speaking, I was on a panel with one of the folks at DISA that's associated with this program, and they're trying to help sort of close this gap. One of the things he focused on was the fact that we don't have a lot of subject matter experts in the space. And so if you look at what the agencies need, they need more SMEs, and one of the things that CISA is trying to do is stand up a CSCRIM service, as a way of helping fill some of those gaps. Also create a body of knowledge to help with the access to the right way of doing things, as well as growing more expertise within these agencies. So again, a lot of work going on there. One of the other things that they've got going on is they've recognized the importance of supporting the acquisition process. Again, if you don't ask for the security in the software, it's not going to necessarily be produced. They're not going to think about it. It's not going to be a requirement. And so you have to make it important in the acquisition process. And so their ACOP, Acquisition Community of Practice, provides an opportunity to work with others. I mean, it was actually some work that was done by the CyberSig, and it I think has ties back to some of the work that I was involved with back at the DHS with Build Security End project. So it's great to see that they're continuing this work. But I expect that they're going to have some output, some example language that you can reference and put into your RFPs and improve how you actually are asking for this secure software. Another organization, which is not a surprise, is Nist. So Nist, and this is, again, a lot of words on a slide, so I apologize for that. But if you think about how their standards work, you have a lot of the foundation with the CSF, the Common Security Framework there at the base. And then on the right, you have the Nist 800-161, which is designed to help identify, assess, and respond to risks throughout the supply chain. So some great guidance there. Now, one of the things that, again, CISA is helping make it real is they did some pilots, they did some proof of concepts, trying to leverage this guidance from Nist. And, their objective is to help identify some gaps. Where are things that you still need to help address, or what didn't work well, and they want to provide aids to other agencies as far as how you then implement some of this guidance. So here's some practical, real-world, specific tools that you can use as you're rolling out your CSCRIM. So I think that's great. Now, one of the things that you see at the bottom is the Nister 8397, and this is the recommended minimum standards for vendor or developer verification of software, and it was created by Nist to provide guidance on secure software used by U.S. federal agencies. And as you'd expect, some of the best practices identified include threat modeling, automated testing, static and dynamic analysis, software composition analysis, and remediation of security defects, and many others as well. So this is, again, something that CISA is looking at as well, hoping to continue to evolve this and provide feedback to NIST to how they can update this as they're trying to identify additional things you may want to do. Now, if you look at the far left, it's getting an eye chart, but the very first bullet under Origin is something called Digital Bill of Materials attestation. And so let's drill into that. Back in May, President Biden issued the Executive Order 14028, which mandates that IT providers must provide a software bill of materials, also known as an SBOM, in order to work with the U.S. federal government. And consequently, organizations are now increasingly looking to integrate SBOMs into their DevOps processes. Now, a bill of materials, that's a concept we're familiar with. It's useful in manufacturing, right, and other processes as well, to list a hierarchical order of raw materials and sub-assemblies and other components and parts that make up whatever that is that you're shipping or selling. And it can help you in that whole understanding of what is necessary to manufacture a product, right? And a software bill of materials is similar in nature, and it's showing the components used to assemble the software that's under inspection or being purchased. And while software vendors who sell to the government are certainly going to be impacted to have an SBOM approach, commercial entities that aren't software vendors, but they also be affected. So if you think about the defense industrial base, since they have developers that are writing custom code for the government, they're going to have to be thinking about how they're going to create SBOMs as well. So it's not just the commercial vendors, but it's also anybody else creating software that's going to be consumed by the government. Any questions on the intent of the SBOM and what it is? All right, I'm going to delve a little deeper. Again, it's that nested inventory or list of ingredients that make up the software. And, this work was started back in 2018 the concept actually goes back to like Jeff Williams back in the OWASP day when he was leading OWASP, and probably in the 2008 time frame. He was talking about having a label with ingredients that can help you understand the risks of the software. But NTIA, under Dr. Alan Freeman, picked this up. The intent is to help organizations determine if they are susceptible to security vulnerabilities previously identified in software components, and whether those components are internally developed, commercially developed, or open source. And, the function that was under Commerce Department with NTIA and Dr. Alan Freeman moved over to CISA. And that work is now continuing within CISA. And, they are continuing to have regular meetings with industries, seeking feedback. The work they're doing is somewhat distinct from what's happening like in the OWASP world, but they do recognize the OWASP Cyclone DX format. But there is other formats like the SPDX and SWID. And so that's great that they're doing this. And since SBOMs are intended to be shared among companies and communities and have a consistent format, this gives you an idea of sort of what that high-level format would be, but you want it to be human-readable as well as machine-readable. There's translations as well. So, like, for example, our company uses Cyclone DX as our primary format, but you can convert this into other formats. So you can leverage tools to make it into a format if you're using something else in your organization. This is a more specific, again, you can't really read it, but the pointers there sort of give you an idea of the what's in the Cyclone DX. Cyclone DX is considered sort of a lightweight SBOM standard, but the strategic direction and maintenance of this is really by this Cyclone DX core working group that is associated with OWASP. I think Steve, what's his name? He's over at ServiceNow, but he runs the Cyclone DX working group. And there's a lot of information in here, and that's great. But having an SBOM in and of itself is insufficient. It's one of those things like, great, I now have the ingredients of the cake, but I really don't know how it tastes, right? I don't know if the ingredients in and of itself is going to be enough for me to really act. If there's a 0 day, that's great. But what do I need to do if I find a whole bunch of vulnerabilities? And so there's something called the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange, or VEX, to help you, because not all products or vulnerabilities are equal. And while they may be present in your code base, as it, you're able to determine that, yes, you have a certain number of vulnerabilities in your code base. Are they truly exploitable or not? And so what do I need to act on? So to reduce that effort, expended by software users on investigating non-exploitable vulnerabilities that don't affect software products, suppliers can issue a VEX. And the Vulnerability Exchange, this is relatively new, by the way. So NTIA has been working on the VEX, and so I don't know of many folks that have adopted this, but this is the concept. And you can see on the left side, on your left side, that if I did a mapping of my components in my SBOM to the National Vulnerability Databases, CVEs, then I might have identified 355 vulnerabilities. That's okay, well, wow, that's a lot. But then if I had a VEX, I could determine that, well, as far as what's important, what's exploitable, it really is only like 99 that I have to worry about. And so this can reduce the pie for you as far as what you need to focus on. And that's the intent. I think the other reality is that you need in an organization that's trying to have a process to respond to 0 days or understand what they've got. They have to have processes and the personnel to back it up, right? Everything is technology as well as process and people. And so you need to be able to have something that you can act on. Now, the work for SBOMs is not done. The folks at CISA, Dr. Alan Freeman, again, is working with DHS, Science and Technology, S&T. They've recently released an RFP primarily focused on startups to get some innovation around tools and other things to help with this. And I think that's, again, the intent of, we're not done yet. VEX is another example. That's great. But what other things can we do to leverage this SBOM process to help organizations be more effective? So before I jump into the case study, I want to go into any questions in general about either the software supply chain issues or SBOMs, intentional versus unintentional. All right. Yes.
Great presentation. One slide you had where there's a lot of discussion happening in the market. When I look at a lot of the requirements that they're putting out, a lot of them are essentially asking the maintainers, who are these volunteers, to do more stuff. So what recommendations do you have for organizations to, I guess, work more closely with the open source community and the maintainers directly, or other recommendations you can make?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges is even knowing the risk level of those communities, right, and having a perspective on whether or not it's a wise idea to consume from those projects. Are they maintaining it well? Is it something that is a guy in a garage? That kind of aspect of it. But then there's the question of, well, how do you get that community rolling if you needed to, because it's a critical component you want to consume. I think some of the efforts, like Google, is putting a lot of money into trying to help shore up a lot of these communities, especially of some of these critical components that everybody's using. I don't know if there's a call for a more broader participation beyond what they're funding directly, but when I saw that this year that they were doing that, I was just kind of blown away how much money they're planning to spend on it. But I think, again, that's one of the challenges is there's the awareness of what the risk is, and then there's if I wanted to change that, do I have the bandwidth of my own development teams to really encourage them and get their participation to help give back? Because that's part of what we need to do. Good question. Any other questions? All right. So, the case study I'm going to do is on Microfocus. So, to clarify, I'm part of CyberRes. CyberRes is a business unit of Microfocus. That's where we have all of our cybersecurity tools and software in one business unit. But Microfocus itself is much larger. And when you're an organization that has over 400 software releases into production every year and hundreds of different building blocks, and when these solutions are developed by over 400 different DevOps teams and use over 10,000 open source libraries, then ensuring that we're not targeted by supply chain attacks becomes a very high priority for our chief technologist team and our organization. We don't want to be the avenue of a vector to a consumer. So supply chain matters to us when you support tens and thousands of different customers around the world, and this slide shows some of the customers whose logos we're authorized to share. Customers use Microfocus software to do some remarkable things. For example, if you live in an area where your broadband or mobile phone service is provided by Vodafone, which is unlikely here, but if you did, our ITOM products are used to organize the billing. And if you are booking travel through Agilent, I can't, how do you say that, John? Allegiant, thank you. I mess up their name every time. Our CyberRes products are protecting your credit card and personal information through each transaction. And if you're eating Kellogg's cereal, which I do every day for breakfast, our application delivery management software is supporting applications that run Kellogg's operations. So, in fact, we're behind the scenes helping to run a majority of the largest companies in key industries in the world. And obviously, Microfocus customers are relying on us and expect us to ensure that we're not a weak link in their supply chain. And I can also say that we're doing a lot on the DoD and the public sector agencies as well. So, and again, taking a closer look at, the numbers and, the fact that we are a large and complex software company. We have around 11,000 employees and have like 40% of those are in R&D. That's more than 4,000 software developers that constantly are working to make over 300 products smarter, better, and faster. They do that through delivering more than 400 new releases of products into production every year. And some of this is being done in agile fashion with more releases every month. And some of the other products are more of the slow maintenance cycle. We do have some that are more of growth products that are rapidly updated, and others that are more legacy. But this portfolio of ours is really an agglomeration of acquisitions as well as organic growth internally. So it's a lot of products and a lot to do. Now, to make matters more complicated, most of the releases represent a complex configuration of components that, again, are ever increasingly, just like I mentioned earlier, open source. Today, I mentioned a minute ago, we have over 10,000 libraries across many of our product versions, and these open source components come with an increasingly creative set of license attributions. In fact, when we started tackling this problem and our supply chains, in many ways, that was the focus, was ensuring that we're tracking and looking at any kind of use of closed-sourced OEM agreements. We didn't want to get trapped by using something that would then, as a commercial product company, create grief later on. And the supply chain risk could be managed through processes that were now being codified in standards like the Open Group and Nist 800-161. But around 10 or 15 years ago, and I wasn't here then, but the use of open source as a foundation for development really kicked in, and it initially became very important to ensure that the license attributions would not create issues, and particularly they want to ensure that we didn't use any copyleft attribute software. And today we have around 300 different license attributions tracked within Microfocus. And I didn't really in the upfront talk about any of the license issues, but that obviously is where we started, was looking at, from a legal lens, are there things that by using open source we're going to get trapped as a commercial software company? And that really was the way of mitigating that risk initially. So actual understanding and checking of licenses leads to some of the broader use cases that need to be covered. And, It certainly amplified some of the 0 days, like Log4 Shell or Log4j, and how we can control that. But one of the things that we're blessed with at Microfocus is that our chief technologist is very active in the open group. He leads the IT for IT efforts there. And so we've done a lot of work in our R&D to create a digital factory in alignment with the IT for IT reference architecture. And this is a concept that Lars has been spearheading, and we've made a lot of progress over the last decade. It's essentially all planning and building and delivery of software in Microfocus uses as a common set of tools and have been integrated and optimized to make essential DevOps value streams as efficient as possible. And we can integrate the supply chain management in this factory and thus efficiently ensure that all R&D is being done the way it needs to be done, and in the process, automate as much as possible. And I do remember, so I was on, I think it was John, 4 years ago when Microfocus merged with HPE software. So I was on the HPE software side of the house, and we merged with Microfocus, and I think it was around 12 to 18 months later that I remember that our HPE software side of the house all of a sudden had to convert over to the digital factory set of tools. And it was like, what the heck? Why are they forcing us to do this? It wasn't until later that I understood what Lars is doing. He's making sure that everybody's consistent and we're all using the same tooling in the digital factory. Because at the time, all we thought it was a pain. I was like, great, we come to Microfocus and we have to do all this work. But it does make sense. So, at the core, IT for IT reference architecture is all about management of digital products so that organizations can optimize value delivery and doing so while interacting and aligning with other business functions. And in the case of supply chain, we need to align with sourcing and the vendor management and the governance and risk and compliance management, those functions there that are highlighted in yellow. So, you have all this as far as in your context of value streams, but the ones that you need to really worry about are those two. So the reference architecture has, again, identified 7 essential value streams for digital organizations that need to be optimized to ensure essential values. So let's look at where supply chain management comes into play. And, in this context, it really is the product supply chain management for upstream and downstream. So where you're consuming and where you're ultimately producing for your consumers. And in this presentation, I'm primarily going to be focusing on the upstream, how you control our suppliers and use open source. And with that lens, it's obvious that the explore and integrate value streams are important ones. And in exploration, you can have decisions on open source or COTS and use, and you can integrate and make detailed decisions on how to use that software and the different versions and the releases. And then at the release and deploy times, you need to nail down and guarantee there's nothing that slips through. So let's look through those particular processes and the unpendings behind them. And this is an eye chart, but the focus is really on the yellow. They're like, as a whole, there are like 44 essential data objects and controls for the life cycle. And I'm really glad, honestly, that Lars and his team deals with all this and I don't, because it looks like a lot of work. But the data object are managed. There are 33 different functions that are specific to this. And fortunately, only a small subset of all these come into play when you're dealing with supply chain and securing it. So if you look at the subset that really is associated with the supply chain, there are 8 essential functions that you need to control and consistently manage in your supply chain. First in the order of control is you need to have a consistent and complete picture of the product dependencies. And in Microfocus, we have a portfolio database that tracks all third-party dependencies, both open source and COTS. Second, you need to control the release. We implement a systematic product to market, or called P2M, governance process, where we track the quality, the risk, the training, the marketing, upgrade, legal, and many other aspects of the release. This function includes ensuring that all the dependency information is in the portfolio, tracking is up to date, and this step also allows us to produce a consistent and up-to-date SBOM for the release. And then third, we're also going to sign and store the binaries in a way. Let me see if I'm off my clicks. Let's see. Yeah, I'm caught up. So we're going to store and sign the binaries in a way that downstream supply chain and our customers can ensure that what they've downloaded and used is indeed what we've officially controlled and released. That is not some kind of counterfeit. And fourth, this is the right one, we regularly compare CVEs and their information with a list of third-party software, and based on that, we can consistently and efficiently update our security defect database and take appropriate action. So that is our process. So, how's it going? Well, fundamentally, it's going well. At the corporate level, they have control, enables the developers to have creative minds, and they don't inherently introduce additional risks, so they're not being those unintentional insiders. And by having a standardized solution, we don't rely on individual product groups to do the right thing as part of policy, but we can essentially track and support it and report on it. And when the Log4j incident happened, we could at speed identify exactly which products and which versions of those products were affected. So, within hours, if not days, we know what needed to be fixed. We could then pass that information on to our customers and could prioritize and remediate in an efficient manner on their side. And Log4j is just one example of many types like that increasingly are becoming more important. But if you look on the right side, you can see some of the things that perhaps are not going as well. We are implementing this year with a rolling it out in a staged way, as like any decent DevOps team would, a set of improvements. And first we're going to do is actually, instead of having a manual approach, which we currently have, which is very time consuming, we're also finding that some people occasionally cut corners. We're trying to automate that process. We're also, if you look at the complexity with regards to open source software and the dependencies there, it's a growing volume and it's increasing exponentially and it's increasing the complexity. And, that is a challenge that, again, makes the approach we're taking sometimes unviable. So let's just look at that last aspect of this to see what I'm talking about. If you don't take into account the transitive dependencies, then we have this picture here. We have each of the product teams with a developer assigned to track their dependencies, right? They're having to track in our database what dependencies they have, both COTS as well as open source. And this is consolidated and checked by 4 full-time inbound technology managers. These people also take care of working with legal. In the case of commercial or COTS OEMs, they work with those suppliers to make sure the right contracts are in place. And in total, we manage around 30,000 registrations per year. So on an average, a product has around 100 dependencies. Now, let's look at where this is going. Quite a big, nasty picture there, huh? So transitive dependencies basically means that you say you have one open source package like Apache, and that Apache web server also includes a component like Log4j. So you have to have that awareness of some of those subcomponents within that top-level package. So further, we, like most other companies, are using more and more open source software, and we estimate in 2 years we'll probably have to track around 150,000 new dependencies each year. And with the current setup that we'd have to have around 25 inbound technology managers tied up tracking on that. Now, again, if you go back to the fact that we have 4,000 developers, that probably isn't too bad of a ratio, but that still is something that we could do much better as far as how we allocate and use resources, right? So let's fix this. Again, if you go back to the digital factory, that sort of comes to our rescue. We already have a standardized source code repository, right? We already have a standardized defect tracking system based on our own product, Octane. A DevOps agile way of working that uses pipeline for CI/CD, a testing system that will scan any new code for security defects that's using our own product, Fortify, that automatically feeds that defect system. And what we're adding is a new technology that we recently acquired, a company called DIB, and they focus on open source security scanning. And DIB has a technology that automatically can scan for dependencies and automatically build a full transitive dependency graph. So not only the top level, but also all those transitive dependencies. And DIB can also scan all the open source in the world, and they have been able to identify all these different dependencies and the associated vulnerabilities with them. And so that code, build this out. So again, you can compile and build those dependencies. You can have the SBOM, make code scanning part of the pipeline, and we can scan up to 20 million lines a day, and you can detect unapproved CVEs associated with that code. So with this new capability, you're reducing a lot of that manual effort, and you get to the point, if you look at the left, 0 developers having to do registrations anymore. You've beaten into them. They have to register all of their dependencies. Now they don't have to mess with doing that anymore because it's going to be automatically creating it for them. And so previously, if it was something they were using, it may have been problematic whether they flagged it or not, but it's going to be automatically flagged, and we're going to be automatically creating identification of the CVEs. And, we're going to be able to basically auto-approve 95% of this, and you don't have to have all those, IT managers managing this process. So it's a true win-win. I think it's going to be great. Again, we're not all the way there yet. One of the other things that I mentioned previously was VEX, again, as a way of hopefully helping consumers better understand what to focus on. That's in the future. It's one of those things that, again, as a recommended approach is still being, solidified, but also we need to put this in place ourselves before we then look at doing VEX as well. But that's in the roadmap. So to wrap this up, again, software supply chains form complex ecosystems. And again, there are external attackers that are trying to inject their malicious code into development pipelines. There are developers that are unintentionally introducing vulnerable code, many times open source, into your development processes. And they're unintentional insiders. Software development teams need to assess open source projects as far as what the risks are, and they understand that prior to consumption. And then we have found that leveraging the IT for IT reference architecture has been a useful tool. We have done all this work over the decade to create a digital factory, and we can leverage the value streams associated with supply chain to be able to inject additional processes. I think, again, there are a lot of great government activities going on in this space. The impact of SBOMs, I will mention there is some controversy about SBOMs in the sense that by sort of like giving the ingredients to what your Coke formula is, right, you potentially could then, as an attacker, better understand how to attack said, or maybe I can create my Pepsi, or in this case, again, better understand what I need to do to attack you if you have not kept on top of things and closed those vulnerabilities associated with it. Now, not everybody has a disassembler to be able to do that, but certainly those more advanced attackers could take advantage of that. The counter argument is that security by obscurity is not going to work. We need to address this by adding more awareness and visibility as to what our software is composed of. And so that's where things are moving. And it looks very likely that this train and the mandate in the executive order by Biden is sort of making it so, right? S-bombs are happening, and the software community is certainly going to have to respond. All right, so that's all I've got. I do want to say that, again, at the top level, what we do at CyberRes is we have a focus on application security. The upper right quadrant is our Fortify product. We have security operations with ArcSight, a NetIQ for identities, a whole portfolio there, and how to do data privacy and protection with our Voltage portfolio. Interset is actually not a separate product. It was something we purchased, an Incutel product that was focused on user entity behavior analytics. It filled a gap in our ArcSight portfolio. We were previously OEM in Securonics, and we replaced that with Interset. It's now ArcSight Intelligence. But the reason we put it in the middle, honestly, is what we got through that acquisition was a whole bunch of data scientists that have created our AI Center of Excellence, and we're benefiting in all of our portfolios now through that acquisition because, everybody talks about ML, but it truly is helping us improve our solutions significantly. And the last thing I just want to position, I co-host a podcast called Reimagining Cyber. We are up to our 40th episode coming out next week, and I welcome you to give it a listen. We try to keep the episodes tight, 20 to 30 minutes, no product discussion, and we've hit a number of different topics to date and looking forward to do a lot more. So with that, I'm going to end, and if there's any questions, happy to answer them. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Mine are up there, right. You're welcome. We have a booth, the Microfocus Global Solutions booth is in the vendor area downstairs, the exhibition hall. So come on by. I'll be there this afternoon. Thank you, everybody. You didn't have to throw anything in. It is a big challenge, though, as far as getting people to participate.
Yeah, I kind of seeded that question for that reason. see you again. I'll talk to you in Angel really soon. Hey, nice to meet you. Matt Darden. Yeah, I saw your presentation yesterday. So yeah, I checked this one out too. You're saying a lot of things then, now you're saying a lot more things that are very aligned to what you're doing. Well, do you know, hopefully, tide lift? Wow, that's incredible. It's all right. We're a safe startup. We're just ready for Series C. But thank you. But yeah, our presentation, it's not, not far off from what y'all are doing. And Chris, right? I just saw Chris and then Nick. You know him? Okay, we met him at AWS at DC a couple months ago. We talked about some alignment. Anyways, tide lift, we do all the stuff we were talking about. That's long product, software as a service subscription. So our co-founders all met at the meeting. They all went to venture capitalism 5 years ago. They're like, hey, there's all these emerging enterprise versions of open source software. But if you look at the vast majority, 70 or 80%, we got 70%. 70% of the software is, they have these individual community-led projects. Like, who's responsible for that stuff, right? And so they built a business kind of taking a page from Red Hat, but also doing features, doing some versions of Ubers and Lyfts and Airbnbs, and we have a two-sided marketplace. So we have a tool and a service that we provide to enterprises, so we make money, and then we have a second marketplace, which is to maintainers. We partner directly with actual open source maintainers. We pay them a recurring monthly revenue stream. So this isn't a donation, it's not a tip jar, it's actual recurring revenue stream for these projects to align to certain sets of standards that we've been publishing. Yes, can't talk too much about that, but yes, it's a state control. So maybe a little bit. We'll see. Emerging per se. But yeah, so salsa standards, but more, they're also involved in the open SSL scorecard. So some of that stuff we're incorporating now into our requirements that we're asking these features. That's why I'm trying to do what the government's doing. It's like, okay, we support both. Start off for our clients. So our clients are producing this model. Yeah, I mean, they're not going to find out. Yes. Yes. So yeah, we see now with the two type for us. Well, I don't know. Make sure, like I work with the platform. It's funny because I don't think Alan cares. Yeah, I don't think Alan cares. I know like Sue Strand. Like I know there's such a requirement. Yeah, making sure that they know what we're working on. So I mean, we're kind of like, it doesn't matter to us, I guess. Yeah. So it's funny you asked that because I was asking our people, like we put a thought leadership piece of like what's the benefit or like drawbacks of each, and my team came out with nobody's really. I did a podcast with Steve, specifically around we got into this from the context of HBS. I mean, we haven't really did. I've been asking clients like, say every other, like even like talk to financial services companies. We're going to go into I haven't been doing some past. I think I was looking at somebody fighter. Maybe they're out there where they thought which one to learn. Yeah, and we are the clients are, right? So that's the idea. So they only work. Yep. Right. Well, yeah, you talk to organizations like Microsoft, right? They recommend to their clients when available get the enterprise version. Their clients will say, "Great, what do I do with all my Python libraries or my JavaScript libraries or my PHP library?" Yeah, there's nowhere to go. So we're filling that hole, and the tool itself